the predictions he makes, they're usually a couple of decades out. He kind of had his 21-year plan, and I put a lot of that in the book. We can check back in 20 years to see if this came to fruition. So it's one of those things where you really do have to think in decades. This is not a quarter by quarter strategy or idea. This is a fundamental shift in how companies operate.
How many chairs are you sitting on right now?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to One Chair. We have another interview today. We were joined by Anil Patel, who is the author of the Bitcoin Handbook and his latest book, The Treasury of Michael Saylor here. It's a great read that condenses the knowledge of all the talks of Michael Saylor over the past years. We talked to Anil about what brought him to write this book, how he went about it. And I highly recommend you also check out the book, which is a wealth of knowledge on Bitcoin and strategy. So let's get right into it. Here's our interview with Anil Patel.
Hi, Anil. We're absolutely thrilled to have you on, so welcome.
Thanks, Yves. Quentin, yeah, great to be here and excited to chat.
So we truly enjoyed the Treasury of Saylor. You managed to craft a very beautiful and seamless narrative from Michael Saylor's speeches and talks. Reading, it felt like listening to Saylor himself. And I thought I had listened to all or most of his talks, but to my surprise, there were quite a few passages that were new to me. So that was a really nice surprise.
Glad to hear it. I mean, that was the intention, right? Is that I hoped that as someone was reading it, they would hear Michael's voice in their head, telling him that there is no second best. But yeah, he's done just so many interviews and given so many speeches in the last 5 years that I really just wanted to condense all of that into one small, convenient, easy to digest package that would be accessible to a very wide audience, especially to an audience who maybe doesn't spend a lot of time on YouTube or on X. So it was kind of trying to access a new market as well of people who would probably find it very interesting what is happening, but just never had the resource.
I really enjoyed reading your book too. And a fun anecdote, I read a lot of books. It's rare that I recommend a book. And it's even more rare that I buy books to hand them to people because I think they're so good. And I did that only 3 times so far. The first one was The Bitcoin Standard by Saifedean. The second one is one, funnily enough, that you mentioned in the Treasury of Saylor. It's the Almanac of Naval Ravikant. And the third is yours, The Treasure of Michael Saylor. I actually first downloaded it onto my Kindle, and 10% in, I thought, oh, this is so good. And with all the nice descriptions and graphics and everything, that I had to buy some hard copies and hand them around to my friends. So thanks for that. It's great work.
Thank you, Quentin. That means a lot. I also am someone who I very rarely recommend books or gift books. It has to be a very specific person and a specific book. So I really appreciate that. And we probably have very similar bookshelves. If those are the books you're gifting, they're very similar to the ones I gift.
The same goes for me. I think the book is so eloquently made, and it's, I think, great for also people that are beginning their journey into Bitcoin.
Yeah, thank you, Yves.
So to begin here, what drew you to Michael Saylor's speeches, and what in particular, so which talk or which idea made you think, oh, this deserves a book?
Yeah, it's a great question. As you are well aware, there's just such a huge volume of content out there. I went through several hundred hours of interviews. I read hundreds of pages of transcripts. I printed all his speeches out, transcribed them all. So there was more than double the content that ended up making into the book. About half of it ended up getting cut. So what you end up reading is really just the pared down version of what is kind of essential to understand to be able to follow his line of thinking all the way from energy through to, money, wealth, networks, and where he is today. So it really just came down to which analogies and lessons would be most useful to the average person. So you're talking about, gifting the book to your family. And that's a similar way that I think is this a lesson or an analogy useful and accessible enough that everyone should understand it. And if it kind of ticked those boxes, then it would, kind of make it into the book. And then the challenge was just threading them all together to make some kind of coherent story out of it, essentially. Because Michael's thinking evolved as well during the time I was writing the book. So it was very difficult. You're kind of trying to follow this moving target the whole way. And obviously that's going to continue to evolve. As soon as the book was published, he's then talking about launching preferreds in different currencies, and which kind of always knew was going to be the case. But I was like, is this book going to be outdated the day it's published? So I tried to make everything, all the content that was included in the book, to be kind of these timeless lessons, that it doesn't matter what happens in the future, you could still go back to it and it would still provide value or use to someone.
It felt that way, to be honest, because when I was reading it, I thought, Saylor has so many speeches and he keeps talking about it. And as you mentioned, it keeps evolving. But the pieces that you chose are timeless, because it really goes through the explanation of how he understood Bitcoin from his way, right? And thinking about that, is there any paragraphs or any pieces from his speeches that made you look at Bitcoin in a different way?
I think the big shift for me was when he started using the term digital capital, or really when he started breaking down money into this subset of currency and capital. That's just something I hadn't really wrapped my head around until he kind of laid it out, probably in like 2021, maybe was the first time he was making that distinction. And I would consider myself like pretty well read in terms of economics and finance. And I just thought, oh, wow, here was just a glaring hole in my own logic that I'd completely missed. So it just kind of took someone to explain it very simply from first principles, that, money is not this heterogeneous thing. It's on a spectrum, and where does Bitcoin fit on that? And I'd kind of mapped out different infographics and posted them over the years pre Michael Saylor. But yeah, a lot of the speeches he'd given helped me like clarify my own thinking, if that makes sense.
Exactly. And so, speaking of it, Saylor often argues that the US dollar will remain as a medium of exchange, and that he sees Bitcoin more of this digital capital and the store of value. Now it's maybe a more of a philosophical thinking, but do you see this as well? Because I feel like there would be a transition phase where that's true, but eventually Bitcoin becomes the medium of exchange and the store of value. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And just to be clear, I certainly don't speak for Michael or have any idea of what his thoughts are at any point in time. But I always recommend to people to read Layered Money by Nick Bhatia. Kind of explains this concept of you have your base layer money, and then you have different forms of credit or currencies built on top, with usually a counterparty in the middle. And so the idea of Bitcoin coexisting with, the US dollar, it makes perfect sense to me. If you understand, network effects and winner take all markets, I think that's what this huge kind of stable coin hype or bonanza that we're currently seeing is a part of, is that all these central banks realize there's only really going to be one digital currency or space for one. So there's this kind of race. And I imagine the US dollar will quite convincingly win that competition. And, you and I, we may choose to use Bitcoin as both a store of value and medium exchange. But I think the majority of the population are a long way off understanding that.
Completely makes sense. And maybe just going back to exactly how Michael likes to talk in analogies and metaphors, not only about Bitcoin, but history in general and so many other topics. Are there any other topics where you learned something from these speeches from Michael?
So I think the benefit of what Michael's brought to like the educational side of Bitcoin is just this very clear engineering perspective of that you should view money, the same way you view any other engineering concept of the idea of a closed system. How can you possibly measure things over time with integrity, with precision? if, the denominator is constantly in flux. And that's something that, Bitcoiners knew before Michael, but just framing it in that engineering way of the idea of an adiabatic system where energy is neither leaving or nor entering a system. Well, now you can kind of conceptualize the point of why a fixed supply money might be useful. And then you kind of go down the rabbit hole of how might you actually achieve that in a way that is sound and can't be corrupted. Because it sounds great in theory, but, if it's going to fall with a committee of 6 people who are going to decide that, then you understand that there's risk in that. So yeah, I just really liked the engineering lens he brought to it. It's also why I asked Preston Pish wrote one of the forwards to the book as well. And again, he's someone I think has a brilliant engineering mind. And Preston and Michael are both, they were both pilots in the Air Force. So they understand like critical systems very well. And there's no more critical system than money.
Absolutely. And I think here it's quite interesting to see that obviously all of this engineering background from Michael Saylor is brought up on his speeches. And you can see it throughout the whole book, because whenever he talks, it always comes up at some point, right? And in that sense, it's quite nice to see how you brought up also in the book the evolution. You basically crafted a very nice story to present Bitcoin in that way, using, in my opinion, the right speeches at the right time. So how did you go about that?
Well, yeah, it's the product of I've just failed so many times trying to explain Bitcoin to someone. And you kind of go back and look through, okay, why did that argument not hold up? Why did that explanation not meet someone, where their own understanding is? And you realize you kind of have to just build up your, I guess, argument for Bitcoin just from such a solid level of logic that you can't really argue with it. So I wouldn't even say the book is making an argument that you should run out and buy Bitcoin. It's just saying, here's what is happening based on the incentives at play. And then from there, it would probably be in your best interests to understand this. And if you're curious enough from that point, maybe you'll go and, investigate how you're going to manage your own savings or wealth for your family, your community, your company. So yeah, it wasn't really meant as a how-to guide of what you should do. It's just, here's a very interesting point in corporate finance. Here's the logic behind why it makes sense to do this. Here's why the incentives say that probably more companies are going to do this. So just be aware of it.
And I thought there was also some interesting aspects to this, because it's not only about mentioning how well Bitcoin is, how well it's crafted through Satoshi's different, basically packaging all these technologies into one and making Bitcoin as it is. You chose to take Michael Saylor's speech where he explains why it's better than real estate, or why it's better than equity as well, right? So I thought that was quite interesting as well.
Yeah, and if you look at where people are coming from, in most cases, they either hold part of their wealth in equities or in, real estate, their primary residence, say. And you're trying to give them that contrast of, say, if you're making an investment decision today with all the available information you have, what, asset class are you looking at? Okay, why? And how would that compare to something like Bitcoin? Because you have to do those comparisons if you want to be honest with yourself. And the idea is, like, if we go back to sort of the whole engineering framing around it, it's not an emotional argument at all. It's really, you're just looking out for yourself. That's it.
And I also found the different pictures in the book very, very interesting, and also very easy to understand. So that was a great compliment to the speeches.
Yeah, thanks. That's kind of how the whole project started, actually, is, I create a lot of infographics and illustrations, and I just started creating more and more related to quotes of Michael's. And once I had enough, I was just testing the waters to ask people, hey, would there be an appetite for a book? And the response just like blew me away. So, yeah.
Yeah, so maybe shifting a little bit gears, right? So we talked about how the book explains Bitcoin, but then it also delves into the Bitcoin treasury part, and there's also the mention of the preferred from Michael. So that was actually an interesting take, because I think that's probably the first book that mentions such preferreds. You're pioneering this as well, I guess.
Yeah, well, my understanding from well, the last time they mentioned it, I believe Strategy were working on some kind of corporate finance textbook in house to help explain a lot of what they're doing. So I didn't want to go too deep into, you know, preferreds and digital credit and all of that, because I figured they will likely cover that. So this was just more to explain that, they tried a lot of different strategies from the start to see what would work, what wouldn't, and they've been pretty clear about owning what maybe wasn't the right strategy initially with, say, the convertible debt, and how now they're trying to phase that out over the next few years, and that is just this iterative strategy. They keep evolving to try to find the perfect formula.
Are you following this narrative with strategy now?
Yeah, well, look, it kind of consumed a good 18 months of my life. If you think of going to bed at night and you're dreaming and you can hear Michael's voice, you probably listened to too much Michael. So I've taken a little bit of a break. I did catch the speech he gave at the Cantor summit yesterday, but otherwise, yeah, I'm not following it too closely. I did see the launch of Stream, and obviously, I know a few people who good friends who work at Strategy, so it's always good to keep up to date with what's going on. But I would say, yeah, I'm definitely not the most informed strategy analyst out there by a mile.
Right. Yeah, I can totally relate to that, because when back in October last year, when Strategy released their 42 billion plan, and I thought it was crazy, and I realized, oh, I need to understand what they're doing here. I went deep into the rabbit hole of MicroStrategy back then, and I was listening to everything I could find about Michael Saylor again. Even though I had already listened to some of them, I was re-listening as well, searching. I even also read the mobile wave and so on, just to deep dive into, okay, what's the thinking behind this. This is really interesting. And for sure, I also had a couple of dreams where Michael Saylor was talking to me.
Yeah, and that just, I mean, it speaks to Bitcoiners. I think they just do a huge amount of research and work to understand things that they don't currently understand. And if you look at everyone out there who owns a particular stock, I wonder how many of them went back and read any book written by the original founders, right? So I think it's really interesting that you have so many, say, shareholders of MSTR who've read the mobile wave, who are reading this book. And then, you get into an earnings call and there's like, 200,000 people watching live. And this is not even an S&P 500 company. So it's a pretty, it's definitely a very interesting point in history.
I agree more. I think we're witnessing history being made, although we might not know it yet, with the digital credit now. So for sure, being part of it is also what makes it very exciting. So you mentioned that you don't follow so much strategy. Are there any other Bitcoin treasuries that you follow or that you're looking into?
Yeah, not particularly. Again, I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of Bitcoiners over the years at different companies, and many of them are now at treasury companies or leading the treasury aspect of companies. So there's just so many different strategies out there in different markets. They're competing in different currencies, so it's I just wouldn't have the time to follow it too closely. And my personal opinion, and this kind of goes back to one of the chapters in the book where Michael's kind of talking about there's only room for one Bitcoin bank in cyberspace, and to be that bank, you kind of have to be 150% Bitcoin. And if you look at just the amount of Bitcoin they've accumulated, in my opinion, it's very difficult that anyone will ever catch them. So, I'm a big believer of doing all the work up front to understand something. But once you're like 80% of the way there, you kind of you can make your bet, you've done the work to understand the thesis, and then any work past that point is kind of just a bit of overkill. So yeah, I don't follow the treasury space that closely.
I mean, it makes sense, right? Because we see the same in traditional finance, where you have a company like Nvidia who's taking most of the market share, or Apple and so on, the Magnificent Seven, right? Where they're taking most of the market share just in general. So it's going to probably be the same with the Bitcoin treasuries, and obviously strategy is leading the way with their enormous stash of Bitcoin as of today.
Yeah, exactly. And that was the thesis of the mobile wave, right? Was pointing out that there are these digital dominant networks that are emerging. They're going to be the killer in their own vertical or their own industry. And that, if strategy was going to pursue this, it had to do it in a way where it would leave no doubt that it was going to be the winner in its category. So, yeah.
Yeah, that was it was a great read as well, I have to say. I really enjoyed it. Felt like going back in time a little bit
Mm-hmm.
reading it.
Yeah.
And so exactly talking about going back in time, so there's Michael Saylor is becoming a bit like this figure. I would probably compare him a little bit to Rockefeller, or a Carnegie, or somebody from the Gilded Age, one of those big personalities. And those have really interesting biographies from Ron Chernow. I don't know if you know those big
Yes,
ones
big
like
fan.
Titan and so
From,
on.
yeah.
And I was just wondering, out of curiosity, if you ever considered doing something like that for Michael Saylor.
You're actually the first person to ever ask me that. Yeah, you know what? Yeah, as soon as I that was always the challenge, was when I was writing the book, trying to go back to the core objective of the book, which was to explain the kind of how Bitcoin had evolved to become this treasury reserve asset, and not to just be a biography of Michael Saylor, which it could have easily become. But yeah, I'll just say through the process, I did accumulate enough information and content that could be the start or beginning of a future biography.
Yeah, I can imagine, and that's why I was thinking about it while reading it. I'm like, oh my, probably you have a lot of content, and can make a book that's this thick, 1,000 plus pages about Saylor. And yeah, so, and speaking of it as well, so Saylor obviously, as we mentioned before, is also still speaking at many conferences, doing a lot of talks. Would you also consider maybe in 4 or 5 years making a second part of the Treasury of Saylor with new content?
Yep, potentially. I mean, yeah, the strategy could evolve so much that it makes sense to do some kind of update. But again, yeah, I just wanted to make it as timeless as possible, that things can change in the future. They could pursue slightly different things, and the book would still be useful to read. If anything, as a piece of history, to understand how this all evolved from the beginning.
One question around, the goal with our podcast is education around Bitcoin treasury companies. And what we're seeing is that it is complex to bring across the message of what those companies do, why it's good for Bitcoin, because you need to understand Bitcoin on one side, but then you also need to understand corporate finance. And we actually were just at a Bitcoin conference in Lugano here in Switzerland, and we did see that most Bitcoiners don't really understand the treasury playbook. So I was just wondering, how do you go about explaining this? I mean, you wrote the whole book about it, but if someone asks you on the street, what is strategy doing exactly? Do you have like an elevator pitch for that, or
Well,
or a short explanation?
I guess, Quinton, that's why I wrote the book, is because I'm not great at elevator pitches. And you know what? Look, it's kind of unfortunate, but I think that the people who are going to understand this are the people who have the tolerance and patience to sit down and read a 200-page book about this. And there are kind of two ways you can approach it. You can either understand Bitcoin first and then understand corporate finance, or you can come from the corporate finance world and work backwards to try and understand Bitcoin. Either way is valid, but I think the simpler path is to take someone who already understands Bitcoin and help move them up the ladder that way. Because if you recognize that Bitcoin is this kind of perfect long-term savings vehicle for yourself, for your family, for your community, then it makes sense by extension of that would also be useful for a company, which is just made up of people creating, say, a product or service. And if they are creating enough value that they're actually cash flow positive, which not all companies are, what are they going to hold their savings in? Should they not also use the thing you're personally using? So it makes sense from that perspective, just as a store of value. But then you have to recognize that there's public companies and there's private companies. And if you're operating in the public markets, well, it's a bit more predatory in the sense that another company could potentially acquire you. So you have to be aware of what your competitors are doing. And if your competitors are saving in something that is harder and appreciating faster than what you are, well, they're going to get stronger than you if everything else is equal over time. And then you become an acquisition target. So there's just very different game theoretical dynamics if you're a publicly traded company, which, the average person is not going to understand. And you have to act very differently than what you would do for your own personal finances. So, yeah, I guess just understanding that kind of predatory environment of public markets versus, private companies or individuals or families.
Yeah, I like this answer. You need to put in the work. There's no easy way around it.
Yep.
I think a version 2 might be might be needed at some point, because Saylor himself says that it's only really the beginning, right? And if things happen the way we think they do, and there's this huge disruption happening in finance, this will be the biggest story of finance of the next few decades. So a lot more to write about, probably.
And that's it. The predictions he makes, they're usually a couple of decades out. He kind of had his 21-year plan. And I put a lot of that in the book, mainly as like a timestamp of, okay, well, now you can compare, we can check back in 20 years to see if this came to fruition. And it'll be really interesting if it does. So, yeah, it's one of those things where you really do have to think in decades. This is not a quarter by quarter strategy or idea. This is a fundamental shift in how companies operate.
Yesterday, we had a discussion with Søren Basher, and he exactly made that same point, that it's not a quarter by quarter. It's something that you need to look at on a longer term and be able to see all of that. Because if you just look at like Wall Street is doing right now on a quarter by quarter, then obviously you're not going to be able to understand the long-term vision of the company at the end of the day. So
yeah. And that's where like some of these new metrics that are being pioneered, like sats per share, are very interesting, because that's a very easy way for people to understand if value is being created or not, irrespective of public fiat prices.
Yeah. Is there anything that you want to add?
Not particularly. I would just encourage people, if they want to read the book, you can do so for free. You can download the digital version for free. And if you find it a bit daunting, my first book, The Bitcoin Handbook, is just 50 core principles or mental models that would be useful for understanding Bitcoin. And that's also free. And it's available in about 10 languages now. So,
all right. Yeah, we'll make sure to put everything in the show notes. And where can people find you?
Just find me on X at Anil Said So. There's some links in my bio that'll send you to all of my work. I have hundreds of presentations where you can just download the slides for free. If you're ever giving a talk at a meetup or a conference, or even just to your friends and family, download them, use them, share them. It's all free.
Amazing. Thanks a lot, Anil. This has been truly fun. And I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Yves, Quentin, thanks for having me. Great to chat.
Thanks, Anil.
How many chairs are you sitting on right now?